My sermon passage is Luke chapter 9, verses 51 to 56. When the days drew near for Jesus to be received up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But the people would not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to bid fire come down from heaven and consume them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked James and John, and they went on to another village. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation. The Samaritan people rejected Jesus. The disciples wanted to call down fire from heaven to kill them. Jesus turned and gave them a piece of his mind. They still didn't get him or what he was about. He dressed them down for it. Jesus rebuked them, it says. And it probably wasn't pretty. And it wasn't the only time that Jesus stunned everyone by being kind, or at least less than hostile, to Samaritans. It was not unusual for Samaritans to be inhospitable to Jews, not just Jesus and his followers. And it was deemed outrageous for a Jew to be less than hostile to Samaritans. So how about we smite him dead, the disciples wanted to know. It's important to really get this. What was the problem with the Samaritans? Isn't there a story about a good one? Well, why do you think there's a story about a good one? Because so many people, so many Jews and early Christians, thought they were all bad. Today, to get the Good Samaritan story across in some circles, it would be called the Good Muslim. In other circles, it would be called the Good Mexican. The point of the story isn't that a Good Samaritan was rare. The wonder was that Jesus dared to tell the story against all his listeners' assumptions about Samaritans. Samaritans. The disciples wanted them taken out. It was in the air they breathed. Back then you might have read something like the following in the Galilee Times, or heard it on JNN, the Jerusalem News Network. When Samaria sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with them. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. A candidate is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Samaritans entering our country until our representatives can figure out what is going on. According to research, there's great hatred towards us by large segments of the Samaritan population. The candidate said he would send all the Samaritan refugees accepted by our country back to Samaria if he's elected. He said, "I'm putting the people on notice that are coming here from Samaria as part of this mass migration. If I win, they're going back." The Samaritan government is much smarter, much sharper, much more cunning, and they send the bad ones over because they don't want to pay for them. They don't want to care for them. I will build a wall. Did you detect the suspicion? Did you hear the conspiracy thinking? Did you pick up on the fear and hatred underlying those comments from my fictional Galilee Times and the Jerusalem News Network? Have you picked up on it in the real newspapers and in the real news shows? Those words were directed at Mexicans and Muslims by a certain opinion leader. People either love the idea of him as president or they hate the idea. But he would have made a great Jewish candidate in Jesus' day, running on fear and suspicion of Samaritans. That's how Samaritans were thought of. That's how they were treated by pretty much everybody. The way that certain candidate for president apparently thinks about all Mexicans, legal or not, and all Muslims, radical or not. There were no gray areas. No wonder the disciples wanted the Samaritans blown off the face of the earth, especially after they dissed their teacher, Jesus. But then Jesus taught them another lesson, the details long lost along the dusty road to Jerusalem. All we know is that Jesus rebuked them for it. And I have to pause here and point out that Matthew has an episode where Jesus pretty much called a Samaritan woman a dog. And it was as much an insult then as it would be today. He learned in the exchange, you remember, he's at first reluctant to share himself with her because she's an outsider. She persists, and in her faith, she convinces Jesus, and Jesus says, "Your faith has made you whole." And he engaged her then. And I like that. And I'm reminded that in Luke 2:52, there's one of my favorite verses about that gives insight to Jesus. It says, as he's a young man, it says, and Jesus continued to grow in wisdom and in stature, in divine and human stature. So Jesus learned. We should learn. And they went on to another village. On their way, it says, Jesus had set his face to go to Jerusalem, it says, twice. In verse 51 and again in verse 53, twice. Because getting to Jerusalem was important. But Luke thought the going was important as well. Jesus had been preaching, and he was fixing to go to meddling in Jerusalem. And it might get him killed messing with the high priests and with Rome himself, but he was resolute. He was going to Jerusalem. Getting Jesus to Jerusalem and to the cross and to the resurrection takes the next 10 chapters of Luke. And the gospel writer fills them with episode after episode of teaching and example by Jesus, lest anyone forget. Jesus is our teacher as well as our Lord. Stopping at the Samaritan village to have God zap the surly Samaritans might have slowed him down. What with all the fire and the smoke and the bodies, and then the investigation and the grand jury and all that negative press coverage. Great video. This is JNN, a Jewish James Earl Jones might intone. And I've gone a little silly here and a little morbid. Again, though, to bring home the point of how similar our situations now are with theirs. The Samaritans worshipped God as Jews did. The Samaritans venerated Moses as Jews did. The Samaritans recognized the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of our Bible, as the written word of God. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as the Jews did. But the Samaritans rejected the other books of the Hebrew Bible, which we call the Old Testament. The Samaritans practiced circumcision, as Jews did. The Samaritans observed the Sabbath and some of the same festivals as the Jews, such as Passover and Pentecost, but not Hanukkah. And finally, the Samaritans' holy place was Mount Gerizim, about 60 miles north of Jerusalem, not the temple in Jerusalem, which was the Jews' holy place. So they had quite a bit in common, the Jews and the Samaritans, despite their suspicions, fear, and sometimes hatred of one another. Now, at this point, my wife said, now, who are they? Be thankful she gets all this before y'all do. She gets the first preaching on Saturday evenings. And she interrupts me. She has no hesitation about interrupting me and asking questions. She goes, who are these people? And I said, I just told you. And she goes, no, who were they? And I said, she's right. Well, they're fellow Semitic peoples living, I think, south of Galilee, but north of Judah, north of Jerusalem. But here's the real thing. They were not taken into captivity by Babylon, somehow. And so then when the Jews were released from captivity in Babylon and they went back to Jerusalem and they rebuilt the temple, those who hadn't been taken into captivity looked at the returning Jews with suspicion. Some of them intermarried with their captors, and they had changed. And the religion had changed while they were in captivity, and then it changed, revolved, and changed further when they went to Jerusalem. A lot of the books in the Old Testament weren't written until during and after the captivity. Well, the Samaritans never experienced that. So Moses is still Moses to them. Those 5 books are the law. They continued practicing the ancient Israelites' religion as the Jewish people went in and out of captivity and Judaism emerged and evolved. Now that's a better answer. But now you know better, I think, why they had so many similarities in their religion and in their culture. And none of that mattered to the disciples. They wanted them killed. And Jesus said nothing to them. By the way, I've been saying it in the past tense, but there are still a tiny number of Samaritans. 777 of them as of January 2015. It's one place that the Palestinian Authority and Israel cooperate to protect this little enclave of Samaritans. On and off, because they've been attacked and harassed by terrorists themselves. So now let's consider our own time and place and our own suspicions. As much as it makes some people squirm, everyday Christians and everyday Muslims have similarities, although major differences, just like the Jews and the Samaritans did. I am not talking about extremists of any stripe who commit murder and mayhem in the name of any god or any religion. That's not what I'm talking about. Christians and Muslims both worship the one and only God. Now, some people argue that point, but Allah is the Arabic word for God, the unique and only deity and creator of the universe. In Spanish, it's Dios. In French, Dieu. In German, Gott. In Arabic, it's Allah. We both owe the roots of our belief system to ancient peoples of the Middle East and to Father Abraham specifically. Muslims, on one hand, consider Christians and Jews to be people of the book, referring to the Bible and the Hebrew Bible. But others count us as heretics. Christians, on one hand, see Islam as a fellow Abrahamic religion, kind of third cousins, but others see Islam as nothing but a cult. We both believe that Jesus was sent by God as a prophet. We generally see Jesus as the Son of God and accept the mystery of the Trinity. Muslims consider the Trinity as a heretical division of God's oneness. Both the Bible and the Quran have stories about the life and works of Jesus, and belief in Jesus is important to both. And some people want to go to war with a whole bunch of them. Whatever this country does in the face of ISIS is one thing. Another war of religion is another, and I dare say Jesus rebukes it. What about the other big source in our time of fear and anger and resentment? Mexicans, legal or illegal, and increasingly Latinos in general. That candidate did not say, let them die in the desert. But he did say, I'll build a wall and make Mexico pay for it if it breaks them. Call fire down from heaven to consume them, the disciples similarly said of the Samaritans, from behind their own wall of fear. We have even more in common with our Mexican neighbors than we do with our Muslim neighbors. They're Catholic, for the most part. Important and critical issues of the Reformation aside, they're Christians. Which shouldn't matter for whether we treat them with justice. I'm just pointing out how similar we are in our political and historical situation now, the Jews and Samaritans and their situation. Some people wanted the Samaritans cut down then. Some people want illegal Americans cut down now. What would Jesus do? What else would he have us do in the face of irresponsible, hateful rhetoric? He rebuked it then. We should rebuke it now. Us versus them always leads to trouble. The similarities between our us and them now and their us and them then, between the challenges of our time and place and the disciples' time and place, the similarities are closer than just rhetoric. And it makes this little lesson from Luke deeper than it might seem at first. It's deeper than don't wish destruction on your enemies. It's more like, don't wish destruction on your enemies lest you bring it upon yourselves because y'all are more alike than you want to admit. Insult does not justify injury. Being right or even being holy does not justify violence. The prophet Elijah once called down fire on the Samaritans. The disciples knew that from their own scriptures, and we know it from 2 Kings chapter 1. So the disciples wanted to kill in God's name too, because they hadn't yet learned the message of Jesus, that violence begets violence, and that Jesus had come to break the cycle of violence. Jesus came to die and forgive, not to kill in vengeance. So Jesus turned and rebuked them. And they went on to another village for another lesson on the long road to Jerusalem, where they would finally learn forgiveness the hard way. Amen.